Hello, everyone. Welcome to our network leadership webinar. We're just going to let everyone give everyone a moment to come into the webinar, get started. So let's just wait a few more seconds before we get launched. Great. Okay, well, I know we're a couple minutes in here, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. My name is Danielle Varda. Welcome to our webinar today. We run a monthly webinar series called Network Leadership Lessons from the Field. And our goal with these webinars is to kind of bridge the gap between what we're learning and hearing about in communities and where that plays into data and science. And so we ask people from community to come to webinars and speak and tell us about their work. Today we have a really special guest, which is one of our own folks from Visible Network Labs. Before we get started, I'm just going to do a couple of kind of background slides. Where you are today is the right spot. Our topic today is on networks and health equity. And our speaker today is Bria Thomas, who is the product manager here at Visible Network Labs. And I am going to introduce Bria in just a minute and let you hear a little bit more from her before she starts presenting. But just before we do that, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Visible Network Labs. I am our CEO and founder, and pretty proud of this team that is working really hard to tackle social connectedness and its relationship to health and well-being and mental health outcomes. At Visible Network Labs, we're a social enterprise with a mission to help people leverage network science to strengthen supportive connections and improve the outcomes of their work. We do that through learnings as trainings and workshops and webinars like today. We provide technology-based data and mapping tools, and also opportunities for collaborative innovation by translating data into practice. But our primary vision is to make invisible networks visible. And one of the things I'm particularly excited about today is, how that mission also lends itself to thinking about equity and how we might add an equity lens to the idea of leveraging networks to solve big problems. There are a few people I want to introduce before I introduce Bria. Dr. Robin Mobbs is the co-director of the CU Center on Network Science. We jointly sponsor our learning programs together. Dr. Mobbs couldn't make it today, but she does pretty incredible work. And, in addition to this title at the CU Center on Network Science, she's also a professor in the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado, Denver, and does all kinds of other jobs there. She's a pretty amazing person, and we'll get to hear more from her on future webinars. I'm also pleased to introduce Drs. Amanda Beacom and Rose Hardy. They're going to be our discussion leaders today. So after Bria's presentation, we're pleased that they will be able to walk through a couple of discussion questions, but also answer your Q&A. So one thing you'll notice is our webinars are pretty conversational. We like to welcome lots of questions and ideas and so forth. Another group I want to introduce is you all. So I really encourage you to go into the chat, say hello, tell us where you're from, why you care about networks, and maybe why you care about equity in networks. But it'd be just great to kind of get a little bit going in the chat of introducing all of us to each other and getting to know who's on the call today. Okay, a couple of more housekeeping things. I'm excited to announce our 9th annual Network Leadership Training Academy. We've put on the Training Academy as a partnership between the Center on Network Science at UCD and Visible Network Labs, and have done that in person for 7 years. And our 8th year was, of course, online during COVID. And we're going to continue with our online program through 4 3-hour sessions on September 8th, 22nd, October 6th, and 20th. So if you are a network leader and you love to geek out on networks and how that kind of works in your communities and your work, then you'll be pretty interested in joining this session. 2 more quick things. We offer the partner tool, which is something that we like to make sure folks know about. It's our way of bridging social connectedness thinking, network science into a technology and data platform. And we use all of that to provide a way for people to collect the data that they need in order to really understand their ecosystems and quality and content, frequency of those measures, and how it can translate into good learning. And finally, Partner Me is something that we're really excited about. It's our social needs, social connectedness screener that links people to resources. And Partner Me is a person-centered tool that lets us bridge network science and the big questions about how do we make networks visible, especially around their one of their most invisible characteristics, which is the way that we're embedded in social support networks. And we use all of that for providers and social workers and other people to really understand that about people and link it to their health outcomes. So just some stuff about us, but what I really want to get to now is our presenter. So before we get started, we usually like to have a little bit of a conversation with folks who are presenting. We have a blog called Visible Us. And one of the things we know is that it's really exciting to share ideas and thinking about networks with each other, but we don't pause very much to just take a moment and look at the people behind those projects. And so before Bria gets started, I like to take the opportunity to just say hello to her and maybe ask her a couple of questions that can help us really get to know her a little bit more. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we know Bria. She came to Visible Network Labs in early part of this year from Florida, and we were really excited to find Bria and that she found us because we basically needed a lot of things in this company. We have folks who do data science and think about network science, and then we have a group of developers and technologists. And Bria bridged those two things for us. She has a passion in public health, as you'll hear about, and all kinds of other skills and things that make her just this very extraordinary fit for us. And so, Bria, I have just a couple of questions for you before you start, but one I was hoping that you would talk about was a little bit about kind of how you come into network science and Visible Network Labs, and when did you kind of discover you yourself were a network scientist?
Yeah, so I actually explain a little bit of this in the talk, but I will say that I guess throughout working in public health and learning about public health, I realized that a lot of what I cared about was interconnected when it came to public health. So I knew that I was in network science when I came here to VNL because I was always thinking at the systems level about issues. So I never felt like issues in public health or outside of public health, when you talk about social justice and other topics around public service, I never thought it was linear. And so I think when I came to VNL, I was able to put a name to my systems thinking, right? And I was able to call it network science. So I think that was like a really full circle moment for me, meeting everybody at VNL and what we're about, to really understand that I was thinking of this in a sophisticated scientific way. But in reality, a lot of us do. And recognizing that, I think, will help us solve a lot of big picture problems in public health.
Awesome. And one thing I don't think will come up in your talk, but which is just really interesting about you, is I know that you have an interest in coding. You've taught yourself to code, and you've also started a group called Aspiring Black Coders. And I just wondered if you could just talk a minute about that and what it, how that kind of came about and what you're doing with that initiative.
Yeah, so I always say when I give an introduction and how far I've come, I try to make it as short as possible. So I hope this isn't too long, but I have had a little bit of a long journey kind of discovering and growing through my passions. And so for 5 or so years, I was working in public health, and kind of as we've all learned, public health is very broad. And so I really wanted to find my niche within the big umbrella of public health. And so I got really interested in technology. And so I thought about it, and I was thinking if I wanted to be a part of tech and being a part of innovative movements in tech, I needed to learn how to build um, tools from the ground up. So I thought the first step was to teach myself how to code. And I kind of discovered a different pathway as I was learning. I wanted support from other people that looked like me. And I wanted it to be a free resource because a lot of boot camps were expensive and I have a lot of student loans still. So I was really just looking for a free resource to kind of help me learn how to code and navigate this like new world of tech that I had no experience in and no idea about. And so I thought, why not use people and community and friendship to do that? So I started an organization called Aspiring Black Coders here in Tampa, Florida. And I did it through the Meetup app. And it's funny because I just said that I wanted to start a group and I showed up at a coffee shop and started to meet people. It was very scary, but I felt like I needed support, especially in the big world of tech. I needed help. And I also wanted to be surrounded by people who looked like me. So that's kind of the short version of how it started, and we're still going today. We're building our own tools together. We built a website recently, and we're thinking about building other products together. And it's just been an amazing journey that I didn't think I would kind of happen upon. I love public health, but I realized I love technology too. And so kind of coming back to VNL was like the perfect marriage of those two things.
Well, awesome. I'm not going to delay us anymore. I think that everyone attending here will really appreciate Bria and the way that she has, brings new insight and learning to us all on these topics and thinking about ways to bridge really diverse areas of thinking and fields and work together. But I think you can tell why we just fell in love with Bria right away. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Bria. You can take over the screen. I'll just end with any ways that folks can get in touch with us, but I'll go ahead and stop sharing and let Bria share hers. And so Bria will give her presentation for some time, and then we will open it up to questions. So as questions pop up, please put them in the chat. We'll also have some discussion at the end. So lots of opportunity for us to engage and talk together. All right, Bria, so when you're ready.
Okay, I'll go ahead and share. Let me put this in presenter view for you all. Let's skip to the first slide. Okay, so first I wanted to start off with kind of a moment of gratitude. I'm really grateful to be with all of you today and just to like be in this space together right now, talking about a topic that I really care about. I've been a student and a learner for a really long time, and it feels really nice to share what I've learned, but also share something that's like really close to my heart, and I really care about this. And I'm really grateful that all of you have showed up just to hear me talk about it. So just wanted to start off with that. So today I'm going to talk about networks and health equity. So let's just jump right in. So we had already a little background into me, so I'll try to make this a little shorter, but I got my undergraduate's degree at Florida State University, and that's where I was able to get an intro into human behavior. And I also was able to get some volunteer experience at the American Red Cross. I was able to participate in the school-wide tobacco-free policy for the first time, so that was great. And I also was able to volunteer at through their alcohol and other drugs program. So my time at FSU, I was able to really kind of get an intro into public health, and my fascination kind of grew from there. And then I decided to get my master's degree at the University of South Florida. And through that program, the College of Public Health, and through that program, I was able to learn more about public health and health equity. And after that, I was able to kind of think about how I wanted to make the biggest impact. And like I was saying before, I was just looking to really find my niche in the broad field of public health. And I realized that I was really interested in solving public health problems using technology. So that's what's brought me here today. And so like we touched on before, that led me here to Visible Network Labs. And like I said before, I was just looking to work specifically for an innovative tech company who was working for social good. And so Danielle gave an intro into VNL, but just to give another quick intro, VNL is a data science and strategy company, and we're working to tackle the problem of adverse social connectedness in the way that we collaborate and provide care. And so our tools like Partner Me highlights the importance of screening on adverse social connectedness as a social determinant of health. And so we're going to jump into and start with a definition. So health equity is the absence of unfair and avoidable differences in health among population groups defined socially, economically, demographically, and geographically. And I'm going to jump to, this is one of my favorite images to describe the difference between equality and equity. And so I'm just going to describe the picture to you all. So there's 3 people watching the same game here. And not only do they have height differences, but they have boxes they stand on to help them see. And as you can see on the left side, there's 1 box for each person representing equality, and each person receiving the same amount of help, not acknowledging the differences in height. And so on the right side represents equity, and that acknowledges those differences. Those differences in height represent the systems that we've created. So it's easy for us to say that everyone deserves the same treatment or everyone deserves that 1 box to help them see the game, but equity is about making up for the ways others are left behind. So acknowledging those differences in height exists, acknowledging that they exist is the first step, and then the next is to give them extra boxes to see the game. And so now we're going to go into some more definitions of equality and equity, just so that we understand what the 2 mean. Equality is each individual group or group of people are given the same resources and opportunities. And equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So I talked a lot about differences, and in relation to health equity, those differences are called health disparities. So working in public health, for several years, I know these disparities very well. And also being a Black woman, these differences in health outcomes are also very personal to me as well. And so these are just a few examples. Black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. Adults with disabilities are 4 times more likely to report their health to be fair or poor than people with no disabilities. African Americans ages 35 through 64 years are 50% more likely to have high blood pressure than their white counterparts. And Hispanic women have the largest incidence rates of cervical cancer than any other demographic group. And so there are many more examples of health disparities, but most of these differences are related to social determinants of health. So where we live, our access to resources, where we work, etc. So this is why achieving health equity is necessary to close these gaps and differences in health outcomes. So now I'm going to tell you all a story, and this story actually took place in undergrad when I was at Florida State. So there's a specific time in my dorm room, and I was just having a conversation with my roommate and her boyfriend. And we were talking, and he mentioned, we were talking about kind of health and wellness, and he mentioned, I just don't understand why everyone can't be healthy. And so for context, class. I knew him. He was a middle-class guy who grew up in a middle-class household. He was physically fit and ultimately speaking from a place of privilege. And so honestly, I could kind of feel myself get upset and frustrated, but I also was able to get curious about his perspective. And I just really wondered how and why my perspective was so fundamentally different than his. And so when I thought about it, I knew people who lived miles away from grocery stores. I knew people who didn't have access to organic foods. I knew people who lived in food deserts. So in thinking about that, I realized that this is not an individual choice, but a systemic issue. 23.5 million people live in urban neighborhoods and rural towns with limited access to affordable, healthy foods, according to the USDA. So that's just an example and a real life example of how health inequities are systemic issues overall and how I began thinking about public health as a systems thinker. And so I want to show you all today how networks can help us view just how systemic and dynamic issues like this are, um, along with many other issues we face today regarding health equity. So this image here represents, so like I said before, this is a systemic issue. And this image here represents the different ways of thinking. So on the left-hand side, I don't know if you all can see my mouse, but the left-hand side is traditional thinking. And most of the time, people or organizations or systems that represent traditional thinking, they lean towards cause and effect. But there are many factors at play when we answer the question, why can't everyone be healthy? Or why can't everyone eat healthy? So the right-hand side represents systems thinking and all of the different factors at play when we answer that question. And so I want to give you all, it might be a refresher, it might be an intro. I know there's a lot of people here from different fields, but I did want to kind of explain the basics of networks. And so fundamentally, networks are just nodes and lines. A node could be a person, a resource, or anything you want them to be. But when you draw out and create maps of these networks, you're able to visualize the relationship between each node and how they connect to each other. They can show how we're connected and the quality of those connections. And so going back to our story time about my roommate's boyfriend, I want to give you all an example. So hopefully you guys can see my cursor, but this is me in the middle. And so this represents my network. In network science, we call these ego maps because I'm in the center. So the lime green nodes can represent my friends and family. And the first two can represent my mom and my dad. And as you can tell, there's a line in between there because they're married and they're connected to me. And so this last node could represent a family member or a friend that is connected to me, but I might not trust them or depend on them for the things that I need. This last node is my pet. So in real life, I don't have a pet, but I would love to have one very soon. So I added that to my network map here. And these bottom three nodes are resources that I'm connected to. So I'm sitting in a very privileged place. I personally have a therapist, and so I'm directly connected to mental health services. I have a car, so I have access to transportation, and I also can easily access grocery stores. And so I have family and friends that I depend on, but I don't necessarily need them to access the resources that I need. So this is another example, and this is a fictional person named Joe. So the lime green nodes could represent their family and friends, and also the green node that represents their pet. This person has a therapist and they attend sessions virtually. And they also have support from a family or friend that he relies on or trusts for mental health. But they do not have direct access to transportation or grocery stores. In fact, they rely on one family member or friend in which they do not trust or depend on. So remember, this dotted line here represents a connection, but they don't necessarily trust or depend on that person. If Joe relies on this family member or this friend for transportation and they do not have direct access themselves, this is how you can kind of envision systemically and from a high level how it's interrupted in their access to grocery stores and fresh foods. So we can break this down even further. Access to grocery stores depends and relates on other factors like transportation, where you live in relation to grocery stores. Do you live in a walkable environment? How is the air quality? Does your neighborhood or community have access to public transportation or green space? This is another slide that we often use at VNL for one of our products called Partner Me. So this is an ego map, similar to the ones that I just showed you of me and Joe. And those maps were about how we were connected to other loved ones and how they helped us, and also how we helped ourselves to access resources and things that we need. So by using network science, we can understand at a high level how organizations work together to provide services for those who are food insecure. So we can look at networks individually, but also at the systemic level to truly understand social determinants of health. So here's an additional slide of organizations locally here in Florida, but also nationally, that aim to tackle food insecurity at the systems level. And in this right diagram here on the right-hand side, this is where you can begin to understand that food insecurity affects a lot of different things when it comes to someone's overall health and wellness. And it can be connected to chronic disease, diabetes, and much more, and can relate directly to the health disparities that we talked about earlier in the slides. So mapping out systems and relationships between the people who support you and your access to a resource can allow for opportunity to provide effective and efficient interventions. Understanding social determinants of health at a systemic level will help us build interventions, and it also acknowledges that social connectedness, transportation, socioeconomic status, all of those things are social determinants of health. So also, what takes place in the formal healthcare system only affects 15% of outcomes for an individual or family. The other 85% is attributed to social determinants of health. So the last thing I want to discuss with you all today is how I was able to make this connection between health equity and network science in the first place. So during my interview at VNL, Danielle told me that we're all network scientists. And I mentioned in the interview that I had all of this background in public health and I needed to kind of read up on network science. But when doing my research about VNL and talking to Danielle during our interview, I quickly understood why she said that. Everything I did in public health required systems thinking. And taking it a step further, when we're all making these maps and connections and thinking at the systemic level, we're all contributing to network science and solving complex problems in more realistic and productive ways. So I want to conclude with this. By making networks visible, we're seeing health equity with a better lens. We're showing that overall health and wellness is dependent on competing factors like social justice, access to clean water, walkable neighborhoods, and other social determinants of health. And by thinking of those things and recognizing that they're important, we are moving towards health equity. So using systems thinking to solve complex problems can help us achieve the right side of this picture so that everyone can see the same game. And so now I'm interested in what you might have learned. I know that some of this could have been a review for you all, but I'd also like to know if anybody learned anything new at all from this talk, and you can also enter it in the chat. And I think now we can open it up to questions if anybody has any.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Bria. It's really great to hear your perspective and thinking on networks and health equity. What I really love about your story is how it evolves from, something that you have experiences in, that you've kind of known your whole life, and that you're always a learner yourself, and bringing it all together. I want to turn it over for our discussion to Amanda and Rose. And one thing I just wanted to kind of touch on, at VNL, we think a lot about equity, diversity, and inclusion, but the people who use our tools or work with us as partners in community think about it as much and more so. And so what we know is we can learn a lot from the communities that we work with and the people who come to events like this. So please feel free to share your own stories as well. I've written once about equity in networks, and I had a really kind of different lens where I was starting to notice that in communities, we were networking so much that we were asking people to give a lot of resources to this work, regardless of whether they had those resources to give or not. We tend to think networks are the answer to big problems. And we tend to think building bigger, stronger, better networks is one way to make that happen. And so I've questioned before that concept of whether it's really fair and equitable in communities who have less resources than those who have more resources, to ask them to participate in networks and ask them to give all of the resources when it might be taking away from their own ability to provide direct services. So, it's something that we've thought about, but I think Bria helps us as a group and a team think in different ways, and also more complex ways about the ways that we're trying to implement networks. But I'll go ahead and turn it over now to Amanda and Rose, and let them kind of lead this discussion. So thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Bria. My name is Amanda Beacom. I'm the VP of Research and Data Science here, and together with my colleague, Rose Hardy, who is our data scientist, we'd love to open it up for discussion and questions on this topic. I noticed in the chat we do have one question from Rick Winter. Hi, Rick. So Rick asked, do we have an example of a network map to show the inclusion of usually undervoiced communities in public health or another area? Bria, one thing that occurs to me immediately when I hear this question is from a very sort of technical or quantitative perspective on networks. One thing that we would expect to see in a network where there was a lot of potential inequity is for there to be one very or several very central nodes that have a lot of connections and a disproportionately large number of connections compared to other members of the network, whether those members are people or organizations. We call that in network science a highly centralized network, where you have power and connections really concentrated in just a few, and that sets the stage for potential inequities, because that means that there's a power imbalance in the network, right? Sometimes those networks have some advantages. For example, when you have a highly centralized network, it may be really easy to quickly convey information because there's one person who's very connected and they can tell everyone else what's going on or what information they need to share. So those types of networks can have some advantages, but I think when you see a network like that, where there are a couple of really dominant key players, occasionally you may have concerns about whether this network is equitable or inclusive or not. Other thoughts that Bria or Rose, you might have on this question, or other members of our webinar audience?
I did, when thinking about that question, it reminded me of kind of my work in the nonprofit space, and how there would be interventions where instead of having people coming into a community that didn't live there, there were actually champions within that community that already had social capital. And so I think our tools do a great job of showing that even those who are underserved already have the powerful and strong connections with people in the community, and that can be leveraged for more effective interventions than maybe someone like me coming into a new place. I might have a different type of social capital, but acknowledging the strengths, I think, that those who might be underserved already have. And I think Partner and VNL, we do a really great job of that. I think that could be an example of how network science can be used to kind of create better interventions for communities.
I would just piggyback on that to say, I think network science is a nice way for us to be able to measure those relationships between people and collaboration, which is often talked about as being very valuable, but difficult to measure, right? And also to be able to measure the capacity of different organizations within a network to take on extra work or extra burden, which may be asked of them and may not be appropriate.
We had a couple of comments in the chat about thinking about network science as a useful tool for community asset mapping, and I would heartily agree with that. Also a point that was made about thinking about how some maps, network connections, are not as trusted and reliable, and that is important to consider in a person's access to resources like grocery stores and other social determinant of health resources. One thing that occurred to me when you were talking, Bria, is in a lot of the work that we've been doing here at VNL recently with partners and clients, we've seen that a number of community and organizational networks are very interested in and recognizing the importance of including community members and representatives who can speak to the lived experience of the social problem or the health problem that the network is trying to address. And so that, I think, has been a great development in terms of inclusion in networks. But I'm wondering, Bria, what you might think about whether just inviting people to participate in the network is that always enough to achieve equitable inclusion, representation, and participation, given what we all know that some of those folks with the lived experience may also be people who do not have the same degree of social capital as other members of the community network?
I think immediately I think back to what I learned in probably my first year through the public health graduate program. And I know we learned about, and I hope I'm saying it correctly. Hopefully my professor isn't in the crowd right now, so I don't say it wrong. But there is a way to do kind of a social assessment before you invite someone or an organization into a network or intervention or program. And I think that if you do it right, I think that is a more effective way of inviting people into initiatives that you want to carry out. And through that social assessment, you really get to know the community's needs and also what they already have and what they already like and what already helps them. It also, I have lots of stories, you all, so I'll try to hold back on some of them, but I just keep thinking of all these stories. And I was on a project I'm here in Florida, and I was a part of an organization that wanted to build a community park. And so we were talking to organizations that lived in the community, and there's a mall here that has been in talks about like shutting down. And it was a big kind of revelation moment for me, because when we talked to the people in the community about the mall and how in relation to where it would be with the park, they were saying that they were upset that it was being shut down because there were a lot of community get-togethers in that mall, and because the mall wasn't doing well, they were accepting any type of vendor. So a lot of vendors were coming in and providing free and affordable resources to people in the community. And I didn't know that until I talked to the people in the community about what we were trying to change. And so that was like an aha moment for me. So I say all that to say a proper social assessment of what's going right, and also what they would like to change and improve, I think would be a more efficient way of inviting people into networks and interventions that is supposed to help them. So.
Yeah, I'm reminded here of, some of the comments and quotes we've all heard in the past couple of years about how it's not just enough to have a seat at the table, but it's important to think about maybe we need to redesign the whole table. Maybe it's important to think about who's at the head of the table, who has actually a voice to speak up at the table. So I think definitely the trends that we've been seeing in networks really trying to incorporate the voices of those who have lived experience is very positive, but we obviously have more work to do and to think about as networks that are trying to do that. Let me just take a quick look at the chat here and see if we have any additional comments. So we do have a follow-up question. Can you, in the follow-up, can you include a resource for that social assessment to invite someone into the network? And I think we could probably provide some references that we can email out as part of a follow-up to the webinar. Yeah, I'd love to do that. Another question here is, what would you say to projects that are asking community members what they need, but the projects are taking 3 to 4 years to get off the ground. How can this be more streamlined?
That's a really good question. Rose, jump in if you have a more immediate answer, but my immediate thought is to maybe not lean towards quickly providing a solution, but providing the solution that best fits the organization. And if it takes longer, then it does. I'm not really sure on how to quickly get community members to kind of come to conclusions and kind of rev up interventions and programs. I'm all about just being thorough, because I will say though that when it's rushed, sometimes, and I think this kind of goes into product as well in tech, sometimes when you rush to create something that you think people want, and then you do all of that work really quickly, and you have this final product, and it turns out that it's actually not what they want. So I think I'm more about kind of playing the long game. And if it takes, a year or so, at least you know that it is something built for the people that you're serving. So I hope it's probably not the best answer you would want to hear, but I don't know, maybe Amanda or Rose might have a little bit more expertise on that, but that's just my first kind of gut answer on that.
Yeah, I think it's difficult, right? I think often, say in academics or in other fields, that things take a long time to get started. And often within a community, there is an expectation that things move faster. And so making sure that everyone is on the same page about how long things will take is part of it, right? Just making sure everyone's expectations are similar. But that's a relationship building thing that takes time and effort.
I think also we know that health inequities are systemic and structural, and obviously, to Rose's point and Bria's point, changing systems and structures takes a long time. So I think adjusting people's expectations to how quickly change or action can be achieved when we're really trying to address these structural and systemic inequities and issues is important, right? We know that we're not going to be able to see change or really significant action right off the bat. And so setting people's expectations toward that is always, I think, a good idea. But worthwhile, obviously the time is worthwhile, right?
Yeah, but also it's hard, right? Because you want to take advantage of the momentum and the enthusiasm of your partners in the community, right?
Yep.
I have a question for Rose and Bria. Thinking about the field of network science, my training in network science is from a organizational and interpersonal communication perspective. The two of you are coming at it from a public health perspective. And I was wondering if you could share with all of us how equity and health equity has been studied and thought about by network scientists.
Rose, I'll let you go first.
I would say, we think about sort of some of these on community levels and things like that, but not a whole lot of like measuring at the relationship level. I feel like there are a lot of models and things that use community level factors in looking at outcomes. But I think we're in sort of a new space here in terms of thinking about it on a network science level, although certainly communication and how collaboration works and agent-based models are out there. But I'm curious what Bria has to say as well.
I agree with that. I think it's similar. And I think one thing, and I kind of talked about this in my talk, but I think that public health overall, when we're talking about health equity, we are talking a lot about network science, like a lot. I just think that, and I know that in my experience and in tech and in new places, I will be familiar with something, but then I'll find out like, oh, there's a name for that. And I think in public health, we talked a lot about a lot of the terminology that I've learned about network science. So like the ego mapping and even like social capital and the theory of innovation are like a few things that we talk about a lot. I just don't think that we use the words, network science, but I think it's addressed often. And it's really great too to find names for things and to know that like I was thinking of it this way, it's just called this like fancy term, right? So my answer is I think we've been thinking in that lens. It's just we don't call it out as network science as often as we should.
Yeah, and I think also one of those other fancy terms maybe is community-based participatory research, right? Which is becoming a bigger thing, and certainly looks at that as well. Is looking at it from a systems level and making sure that the right people are at the table.
Absolutely.
To get the right answers.
Yeah, I think coming from my training, which is in communication and is more sociology based, I think network science has, if you look for articles or research that focuses on equity in networks or health equity explicitly, you don't find a lot. But I'm hopeful that in the future that will change. However, there are some really key principles in network science that can be applied to the topic of equity and health equity, and that are very relevant. I think the network science community has done a lot of research about how power operates in networks, and that of course is very relevant to issues around equity. I think one of the basic concepts in social networks is this concept of homophily, which is just the idea that people or organizations or whatever actor you're looking at in a network, those actors that are similar in some way tend to have relationships with one another. It's the principle of, birds of a feather flock together. And because of that natural tendency, both we see it in almost every type of network, animal networks, human networks, organizational networks. It's a very, very common finding in networks, and that principle of homophily, of course, leads to networks perpetuating inequities, right? Because if the same types of people are the only members of a particular network, it is obviously excluding others. And you see a number of network researchers applying that concept of homophily and the way that it can create inequities, particularly in the context of people's workplaces, in hiring, in people's professional careers. So there has been quite a bit of research about what is literally, of course, the old boys network, right? That networks in professional settings that exclude certain types of people. So I do think network science has done some work there, but I think, and I'm hopeful that network science academics will do a lot more sort of very explicitly oriented research toward how networks either perpetuate or can combat inequities. Well, I'm realizing that we are almost at the close of our webinar with you today. I did want to just ask one final question as a summary question, which is Rose and Bria and any other audience member, if you could just reflect for a moment on what ways that network science, in comparison to other tools that we have in public health and healthcare and social services, what ways is network science particularly well suited as a tool to identify and address health inequity?
I think I will say that, and I kind of want to bring more of technology into this as my last point, in that overall, I think the way that we can really solve problems is for all of these disciplines to come together. Because as we're realizing in this talk, there's so much overlap in what we study in public health, what we study in network science. And if we kind of leverage all of that knowledge and put it together and use technology to broaden our scope and our reach, that is really powerful. We kind of know now with COVID and the pandemic that we have some very large scale issues in our public health system, in our social services systems. And they're so large that I feel like us banding together and understanding that these problems are dynamic and using tech to reach more people and in an equitable way, right? So making sure that more people means more access. I think that it might be a little bit off from your question, but I feel really passionate about network science and public health and other social services disciplines to come together to create innovative tools to kind of decrease these health disparities and really make an impact at a large scale.
Yeah, and I would say also that I think we're seeing a greater recognition of things like social connection as a social determinant of health, and there haven't been great ways for us necessarily to measure that other than very long surveys. But I think network science gives us the opportunity to measure some of those things as well in a different way than we've been thinking about it before.
Well, that will need to be the last word. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today to discuss this really important topic. Rose, thank you. Bria, thank you so much for your presentation. And again, thanks everyone for joining us. We hope that you learned something from this webinar, and we hope that you'll continue to share your own insights about this topic with us. Thank you.
Thank you all.